I'm Gary Edelman with the Civil War Trust War Department, and the Civil War Trust is currently trying to preserve 4 acres around Lee's headquarters at Gettysburg. And I'm here with the greatest living expert on Lee's headquarters at Gettysburg, historian and licensed battlefield guide, Tim Smith. Thanks for joining us, Tim.
Thanks.
We're going to try to talk about Lee's headquarters and the fight around it as quickly as possible. You ready?
Ready.
Who lived in the building that served as Lee's headquarters?
At the time of the battle, it was the widow Mary Thompson.
When was the house built?
We think about 1833.
Who owned the house?
The house was co-owned by the widow Mary Thompson and Thaddeus Stevens, who purchased it in 1846 in trust for Mary Thompson.
The guy from the Lincoln movie?
Yes, the famous Thaddeus Stevens was a resident of Gettysburg for many years.
And how many children did she have?
She had 8 children.
And did any live in the house with her?
At the time of the battle, her children had all grown and were married, and 2 of them were living nearby, but she lived in the house by herself, we believe.
One of them lived particularly close, right?
Yes, James Henry Thompson, her son, lived directly across the street in a house which is also part of the property in question.
And what happened there during the battle?
During the first day of the battle, the Northern Army used the ridge around the house as a defensive position. The Southern Army attacked and captured the ridge. There was heavy fighting around the building, and in the railroad cut directly behind the house was possibly the largest mass capture of Northern soldiers during the battle.
What units were actually positioned on the track the Trust is trying to save?
There's an excellent account that the 143rd Pennsylvania of Roy Stone's brigade was actually positioned in front of the house near the Chambersburg Pike during the battle. And of course, Battery B, 4th U.S. Artillery, made a stand near the Chambersburg Pike on that property. And possibly part of the 6th Wisconsin was there at some point, part of the famous Iron Brigade.
Well, this is some famous units here, but this is just a little skirmish, right?
It was a scene of heavy fighting on July 1st.
The Confederate commander, Robert E. Lee, arrived on the field and ended up using this house?
Yes, there's much evidence on the evening of July 1st. One of his staff officers selected the house as the location of his headquarters. We should remember that headquarters is not just the location of the general's headquarters, but also all of the staff officers and all the tents associated with the headquarters operation.
So it's a headquarters complex and it is in and around the house?
That is correct. So we do believe there's good evidence that Lee actually was in the house and used it as his headquarters, but there's a whole headquarters complex around the building such as this.
And we know exactly where he pitched his tent, right?
No. As a matter of fact, there's much controversy as actually where the headquarters tent was pitched. And today there's actually an upright cannon barrel that supposedly marks the spot of his headquarters tent. But that documentation for that marker is not very good.
Well, and I actually see right on the marker, there's a quote saying that his headquarters was right there across the road.
Yeah, right on the headquarters marker, which was placed there around 1920, there's a quote saying that this was the site of his headquarters. And it's actually a quote by Robert E. Lee. But in fact, it is not a quote by Robert E. Lee.
So what happened to the building and the area around it after the battle?
Well, for many years, it continued on as a private residence. But eventually, it became Lee's Headquarters Museum in 1921. And then eventually, a motel was added to the complex and a restaurant.
The Civil War Trust preserves battlefields. Why save a house?
Well, I think it's interesting when you go to other battlefields, the headquarters of the prominent generals are always a landmark associated with the fighting. But for whatever reason, this never has been. And this is the site of the nerve center of the Confederate Army during the battle.
And as if all the history you just described isn't enough, Matthew Brady and his crew came and took pictures of the house, right?
Matthew Brady recorded several images of the house at the time, which provide us with valuable insight to the appearance of the building at the time of the battle.
And didn't he take 3 more pictures actually from the property the Trust is trying to preserve?
There is a famous panoramic view of the town of Gettysburg recorded just to the east of the building looking towards the town.
And across the road on the other parcel we're trying to preserve in association with the John Thompson house, he's put his tripod down and took a very famous image as well.
One of the more famous photographs associated not just with Gettysburg, but of the entire American Civil War was recorded on that ridge of 3 Confederate prisoners along a rail barricade.
If the Trust left it up to you to restore this land, what would you do?
If it was my choice, I would restore the historic snake rail fence along the Chambersburg Turnpike, remove the unhistoric parking lot, remove the hotel, reconstruct the historic arbor in front of Lee's headquarters itself, remove the restaurant. And for the first time in 75 years, this area will appear much as it did at the time of the battle.
Thanks so much for joining us, Tim, and thank you for watching.
I'm Doug Ullman of the Civil War Trust, sitting here on the east slope of East Cemetery Hill with Tim Smith and Sam Smith, no relation. Tim is a licensed battlefield guide here in Gettysburg for over 20 years, and Sam Smith is on the Civil War Trust staff. Guys, a lot has been made of the decision to attack, or rather to not attack, Culp's Hill on July 1st, 1863. Tim, did the Confederates have a chance of even taking Culp's Hill on July 1st?
Sure. Most people who have read about the Civil War have heard of the order that Robert E. Lee supposedly sent to General Richard Ewell, and that order would be attack Culp's Hill if practicable. Robert E. Lee actually was asking General Richard Ewell about the opportunity to attack the hill occupied by the enemy, which would in fact be Cemetery Hill. It's not until after the war that this whole argument is shifted to whether the Confederates should have attacked Culp's Hill or not. It seems that Robert E. Lee is feeling Ewell out about the ability to attack Cemetery Hill, which was in fact occupied by the enemy on the evening of July 1st.
And they probably couldn't have taken it anyway.
And I think...
Well, let's not go too far here. I agree with what you're about to say, Tim, which is that it was in fortified position with fresh troops, and you had general officers up here that were able to handle the situation. But I don't think that it can purely be assessed from the tactical perspective. I think you also have to think that the Union Army had just suffered one of their worst defeats of the war as the sun's coming down on July 1st, and who knows what they would have done if they had to face another renewed Confederate attack in the evening.
Prior to Gettysburg, Ewell was reporting to Stonewall Jackson, and Jackson's style of command is very different from Robert E. Lee's. How does that affect what happens here on the night of July 1st?
Well, there's only so far you can go with, what if Stonewall Jackson was at Gettysburg? But if we can put him in on the field north of town on July 1st, I think he certainly would have pushed and at least attempted an attack on Cemetery Hill. And my thought is that if that first initial attack had ended in failure, then yes, Cemetery Hill is probably impregnable. But one attack could have been enough to dislodge a somewhat demoralized Union Army at that time.
We've pretty much established that, with all the batteries that were here on East Cemetery Hill, West Cemetery Hill, that it would have been, at very least, very difficult and very costly to assault this place. What about Culp's Hill? Do we think that it's, sort of the violence of action that Stonewall Jackson can bring to the Confederate Army that is the reason that people think, if through rose-colored glasses, that this could have been a moment of success for the Confederate troops?
Well, what is it that Jackson said? When you beat an enemy, stay on them, and that way a smaller force can defeat a larger one every time. I think Jackson was the kind of man that would push the troops one step further up on these hills. He's a guy that is willing to take a loose order and run with it and use it to its fullest extent. And you see consistent failure to do that by all the Confederate Corps commanders here at Gettysburg. And I don't think it's a coincidence that after Gettysburg, you start to see Robert E. Lee really take his army in hand and take and exercise much more control over the movements of his corps.
From my interpretation of it, by the time Johnson gets his troops into position, it's far too late in the day, and there are more people on Culp's Hill than there were when those scouts came up in the first place.
Perhaps they believe Johnson would get into position earlier and make more of a contribution to the battle on the eastern side of the field. But Richard Anderson's division is not used on July 1st, and they can be used, and they are nearby, and Lee is near them. So A.P. Hill and Lee are on that side of the field. That's why I pushed towards that. And I think, just to point out, as time went by, the blame began shifted over here to Richard Ewell, and he became a convenient scapegoat. Isaac Trimble writes after the war that he had a discussion with Robert E. Lee on the evening of July 1st. He writes that he argued with Richard Ewell about the possibility of making the attack on the evening of July 1st. I personally don't believe him. I don't find him a very reputable source for the information that happened here on the evening of July 1st.
I would close it by saying that after all the successes on July 1st, it would be worth one attempt to try to take these heights by storm. And where would I place the blame for that? I would probably place it more on A.P. Hill than Richard Ewell. Maybe it wouldn't have worked, but I bet if you asked any Confederate soldier afterwards, hey, do you think we should have given it a shot on July 1st as opposed to waiting to really be massacred on July 3rd, I bet they would all say, yeah, we should have given it a shot.
And unfortunately for the Southern Army, the failure to take the ground south of town on the evening of July 1st would lead to their attacking that same position on July 2nd and 3rd.
Well, there you have it. No easy answer, but here we are at Culp's Hill, and we thank you, Tim, thank you, Sam. Hope you had a good time and enjoyed watching it. Thank you.
It's a familiar story. July 21st, 1861, the Union soldiers drive Confederates off of Matthews Hill and toward this hill on which I stand, Henry Hill. The Mississippi, Louisiana, and Alabama troops are disorganized. Things are going very poorly for the Confederacy when their commander, a guy named Bernard B., looks off into the woods behind me and sees the Confederates forming. He sees Thomas Jonathan Jackson's soldiers, and they're ready, and he sees them and says, "There stands Jackson like a stone wall. Rally around the Virginians," which these Confederates do. The Confederates win the battle, and Thomas Jonathan Jackson will become Stonewall for that particular act. If only it were true. There are only 3 known accounts of soldiers who actually heard and saw Bernard B. say this about Stonewall Jackson, and all 3 of those soldiers, all from the 4th Alabama, said 2 very important things. One, that when B spoke of Thomas Jonathan Jackson in that way, that it had taken place hours after the Confederate troops had fallen back from Matthews Hill. They were already reorganized, and the accounts also suggest, very importantly, that when Bernard B. said this about Stonewall Jackson, that he said, not "there stands Jackson like a stone wall, rally around the Virginians," rather, "there stands Jackson like a stone wall, let's go to his assistance." B's and his men were helping Stonewall Jackson to achieve their goals that day. Bernard B. was mortally wounded soon after he spoke these now immortal words, so no one ever got to really ask him exactly what he meant by those words. He could not have known the import of what he happened to have uttered during the heat of battle, but the name stuck, and in my opinion, the name fits, and he carried that name, Stonewall Jackson, for the remainder of his relatively short life. I'm Gary Edelman with the Civil War Trust, and I'm here today at the West Point Museum with curator Mike McAfee. And Mike has brought out some cool stuff for us today, and why don't we just get started? What's this?
Well, it's a little bit of everything, but it all relates to Appomattox in some way or another, because we're getting ready to do a special 150th Appomattox exhibit here at the museum. This framed material was put together by Elizabeth Custer. They are fragments of souvenirs that George Armstrong Custer kept from the Appomattox time period. First, you have a piece of the surrender towel, a piece of his red scarf or necktie, and then a piece of veneer from the surrender table. Surrender table was purchased by Sheridan and gave it to Custer, said, "Give this to Libby."
And what do we have here?
Well, this is the field service belt of Ulysses Grant. We don't know for sure that it was worn at Appomattox, but it was certainly worn during the war, and since it came with other things that were associated with Appomattox, it could have been.
It sort of looks Grant. It doesn't look new.
Oh, well, it's plain, it's simple, just black leather. Of course, the dress belts had gold trim on them as well. So
good. And contrasting with this piece looks particularly new and well kept.
Well, it should be. We don't know how often it was used, but supposedly it was worn at Appomattox, and that was by Robert E. Lee. And of course, general officers north and south alike wore the buff or yellowish sash.
Would he have been able to put this thing on himself, or did it require help?
No, you could do that by yourself. It was the Zouaves that had to have help because they were like 9 or 10 feet long. This is probably about 6 feet.
Well, can we unroll it right now and put it on me, for instance?
No, I'm not going to do that.
Well, thanks, Mike. I don't know if I've ever stood next to so many cool Civil War things at once, so thanks for having us, and thank you for watching.